Milton's Paradise Lost is the last great epic in the Western tradition. And we know that he had first intended to write an epic about the Arthurian legend, and Milton thought he could set his sights a little bit higher and write something with a more cosmic scope, and so he decided to write about the fall of man in the Garden of Eden. The metaphysical poets came up with what are called conceits, that is, analogies or metaphors that are unusual, that even take some work to figure out. They're creative, they're different, they're kind of mind-bending sometimes.
Shakespeare has given us a play that shows justice opening up into mercy, the letter of the law being enforced so that mercy can season justice.
The British Empire controls something like 75% of the landmass of the planet. Liberty, equality, fraternity. Liberty is all very well, but you cannot talk about whether liberty is good or bad without saying when and for whom. The Romantic movement, privileged instead of reason, emotion, intuition, imagination as sources for meaning, truth, and significance.
The scientific revolution was really a continuation of Plato's project of describing the physical universe with mathematics. But it wasn't until Isaac Newton invented calculus that this Pythagorean Platonic project could really take off. Indeed, Newton was the culmination of the scientific revolution, and he was also the fulfillment of Plato's Pythagorean dream. Reason became the new authority, sometimes above the church, and certainly above Aristotle. And so the scientific revolution of the 1600s sparked the Enlightenment of the 1700s, an intellectual movement that has largely shaped our culture today.
Dickens deliberately wanted to change people's hearts about how they treated people, and he used Christmas to make people be more sensible and sensitive to those around them. All of her novels are about the doings of people in the countryside and rural areas in England, their relationships, their small concerns on a small local level. But that's what makes them so delightful and so timeless. One of the reasons this is the most famous chapter in the story is because this sort of encapsulates what may be Dostoevsky's answer, his answer to the problem of evil. The answer doesn't come with our intellectual arguments. Remember what Edmund Burke said about the wisdom that comes from generations upon generations, from a nation or a culture growing slowly over time and developing a wisdom that's greater in its cumulative size than any one human lifetime could ever achieve.
In-person conventions are canceled this year, so we are bringing the convention to your home. April 20th through 27th, enjoy all the deepest discounts we normally reserve for conferences and conventions, including free shipping. During the sale, we will also feature full lectures from Old Western culture, as well as a virtual booth time, live videos where we will discuss our products and answer questions in real time. Get all the details at romanroadsmedia.com.
Welcome back, and today we're discussing Dante. In previous lectures we've been talking about Thomas Aquinas, the great theologian of the Middle Ages, whose theology influenced all of later Western culture, both Roman Catholic and Protestant, who gives ways of thinking and categories and ways of asking and answering questions to the Western world, but also who's a great influence on our poet now, on Dante. And so the things that we've seen in Aquinas will come into play here. Dante, as I said in the last lecture, was Italian, lives in the last half of the 1200s and the beginning of the 1300s. He writes this poem in the vernacular language, in the Italian of his day, so that everyone, not just educated people in the Latin language, but everyone who could read would be able to read this poem. And he writes it partly as a way of expressing the answers he'd come to when he asked what it all means, when he was disappointed by by things in his life. The Beatrice, the girl who he had loved when he was young, had died. He's now in exile. Hopes for peace in his home city of Florence are crushed because the Holy Roman Emperor died before he could come and impose peace on the city. All the things that Dante had pinned his earthly hopes on are taken away from him. So Dante is grieving. He's lost. He's lost his perspective. He's at sea. He doesn't have anywhere to put his hopes anymore. So although he's a Christian, he's really confused and he's lost his perspective. And so the poem begins with that lostness. If you look at the beginning of Canto 1, we can see this. He says, "Midway this way of life we're bound upon, I woke to find myself in a dark wood, where the right road was wholly lost and gone." Now, on the literal level, the character is lost in the woods. On the allegorical level, this is Dante, who's lost and confused in his life. Let me mention as an aside that I've asked you to read aloud, and let me just suggest again how poetry should be read aloud. It should be read naturally. Many people, especially young people, can tend to make the mistake of reading rather woodenly. They read to the end of a line of poetry and stop, because the line breaks there, and then they read to the end of the next line and stop. But that can sound very forced and unnatural. What you should do is read naturally according to the punctuation, just as you would read prose. Let the poet do the work. If he's a good poet, and Dante's a master poet, then you don't need to worry about making the poetry come out in the feel of your reading. It will come out if you just read the poem naturally. Let me illustrate what I mean. In the first stanza, there is punctuation at the end of each line, so this won't be a problem. And so we read, "Midway this way of life we're bound upon, I woke to find myself in a dark wood, where the right road was wholly lost and gone." Now I pause at the end of each line, but I paused because there's punctuation there. In the second stanza, the next three lines, there's no comma or period or any kind of punctuation at the end of the first two lines, but there's a semicolon at the end of the third. And most translations will have a similar thing. And if your translation is different, the principle will still apply. If there's no punctuation at the end of the line, don't stop. Otherwise, it'll sound like this. "Ay me, how hard to speak of it, that rude and rough and stubborn forest, the mere breath of memory stirs the old fear in the blood." Oh, that sounds bad. Read it naturally according to punctuation. Don't think that it's poetry, just think this is somebody talking. So it should sound like this. "Ay me, how hard to speak of it, that rude and rough and stubborn forest, the mere breath of memory stirs the old fear in the blood." And then it sounds the way it's supposed to. If the poet is a good one, as I said, and he is a great one, then he'll let the poetry come through. You don't have to force it. Let him do the work. Just read the poem naturally. That's the way to read all poetry. All right. So here in Canto 1, he's lost in the woods. He talks about how terrifying it is. Even the memory of it chills him to the bone. And he says, "I don't know how I got into it because I was heavy and full of sleep when I stumbled from the narrow way." And allegorically, this means that he hadn't been paying attention in life. He'd been focused on the wrong things other than God. And remember, Aquinas said that we find our happiness by pursuit of our final end, which is God, and everything else should be excluded or brought into play in pursuit of that end. But Dante has been pursuing other things without thinking about his pursuit of God. He's been thinking about his political job in the city. He's been thinking about his family and his poetry and other earthly considerations. Now, those are okay as long as you keep them subservient to the ultimate goal of every Christian, which is the pursuit of union with God through Christ. But he'd forgotten, and so he says, "I was heavy and full of sleep when I stumbled from the narrow way." But as he stands here, he looks up, he sees the morning rays of the sun shining down, and this calms him down a little bit, but unfortunately he sees some wild beasts come and threaten him. And just then, the poet Virgil shows up. And Dante is amazed because Virgil, he's been reading and studying Virgil all his life. He considers Virgil his philosophical master. And here he is. Virgil appears. "Virgil, why are you here?" And Virgil says, "I've been sent to guide you on a journey." And so Dante, led safely by the poet, can escape these fierce beasts, and he can begin to get up out of his lostness and follow Virgil. And Virgil tells him that the journey he's about to take will take him down through the circles of hell to the center of the earth, and then out the other side, and then up through the circles of Mount Purgatory, and then jumping from there up into the spheres of heaven. He will ascend through the spheres of heaven up until the abode of God himself. So Dante will be going through all of space, hell, purgatory, and heaven. Now, why must he do this? Well, because Dante's lost. He has to regain his perspective, his understanding of the universe and himself in relationship to God. But in order to see that, he's got to see the consequences of sin in hell, the consequences of repentance in purgatory, and the consequence of union of God and bliss in heaven. Right, so in the first two cantos, we hear that Virgil has been sent, and we hear that Virgil has been sent by three ladies in heaven, Beatrice, Saint Mary, and Lucy. And these three ladies, Saint Mary and Saint Lucy, along with Beatrice, have looked down and seen that Virgil's lost, and they're sort of patron saints of his, and they're concerned for him, and they send Virgil because they know that that Dante loves Virgil. They know that Virgil has something to offer. Virgil will help and be a guide for the first part of the journey, when what Dante needs is to be strengthened in his normal, natural human capacities. Now, let me pause here and talk about the natural man, because that's what Virgil represents. And Dante has to be strengthened in his natural man before he can be strengthened by supernatural grace in the view of this poem. In 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul talks in chapter 3, he says, the natural man cannot receive the things of God because they're spiritually apprehended, right? So many people interpret this as natural man, that is corrupt, depraved, wicked, fallen man can't perceive the things of God. But that's not at all what Paul means. When Paul says the natural man, he's using a phrase that Aristotle had coined, and Paul is echoing Aristotle. When Aristotle says the natural man, he means man at his best, not his corrupt, depraved, monstrous worst. Man at his best, at his highest, man exercising reason, man exercising the virtues. So natural man is man living according to nature. And Aristotle argues in his book, The Ethics, and in other places, that when man lives according to nature, when he lives according to the virtues, the strengths that he's made to follow, he is happy. That's how man achieves happiness. So natural man is man living according to nature. That doesn't mean following his bestial, sensual instincts. That means man recognizing that he's made to be virtuous and living according to that. That's natural man. So what St. Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians 3 is that even man at his best, not man at his worst, but man at his best, exercising reason, subduing the passions by strength of will, following the natural virtues, even man at his best cannot perceive the things of God because they're spiritually discerned. Man needs supernatural grace. Well, Dante understands all this, and so Virgil represents the natural man that Virgil must be strengthened in, and then, later in the poem, he'll enter into the abode of the use of supernatural grace. But before that, he first has to learn what man is in his proper nature. And so Virgil represents this. Now, they begin to move along on their journey. Virgil says, you've got to come with me, you've got a journey to take, it's going to be pretty weird and pretty wild and maybe terrifying, but here we go, buckle up. And so at the beginning of Canto 3, they enter the first abode, the abode of hell. At the beginning of Canto 3, there's a very famous passage and a very famous line. You may have seen this. Amusement parks and fun houses at carnivals like to put this as a sign over the entryway. Abandon all hope, ye who enter here. It comes from Dante. In the first three stanzas of Canto 3, we see the words engraved on the adamantine gates, these massive black gates at the entrance to hell. Pretty terrifying words. They say, through me the road to the city of desolation, through me the road to sorrows diuturnal, through me the road among the lost creation. Justice moved my great Maker, God eternal wrought me, the power and the unsearchably high wisdom, and the primal love supernal. Nothing ere I was made to be, save things etern, and I etern abide. Lay down all hope, you that go in by me. Except, of course, we should read this in a deep, guttural James Earl Jones voice, right? Abandon all hope, you enter here. Because this is the gate to hell, the place of eternal lostness. Nothing more terrifying than that. Well, these words are interesting. Justice moved my great maker, say the gates to hell. God eternal wrought me. The power and the unsearchably high wisdom and the primal love supernal made me. Justice, wisdom, power, and love are responsible for hell. We can ask ourselves this question, is hell a good place or a bad place? Well, most everybody would say it's a bad place. Well, who considers a prison a bad place? The prisoners. But we make prisons because prisoners need to be contained, restrained, punished, etc. So prisons are good places because they enact justice. We shouldn't listen to the prisoner's definition of prison. Of course they don't like it. They're the ones in it. But they're not the ones who defined the quality of a prison. We do. And so the people in hell, of course, don't like it. It's eternal torment. But they're not the ones who get to judge the virtue of hell. God made hell. Hell is a good place because it enacts his justice. Love made hell. How's that, we say? C.S. Lewis wrote a very interesting poem in his collection of poems, just called Poems, in which he says that the bounds of hell are limited and finite by the love and mercy of God. So hell is made out of love because of the evil that will not bow the knee to God, the evil that will not repent, is contained so it cannot taint and blackmail the rest of the universe. It's put in its place, bounds are drawn around it, and God in his mercy and love for the rest of the universe that does love and follow him will not be tainted by evil. Evil is restrained by God's mercy and his love. Hell is a place made by God's wisdom. So hell is a good place because God made it. God is not absent from hell. The people in hell feel the absence of God because they have rejected him. But God is omnipresent. He is not absent from there. He rules in hell. And that brings us to another question. Who is the king of hell? Well, people always think, well, Satan. Well, no. We should know that Satan is one of the prisoners in hell. In fact, in this poem, we'll see he's the bottom-most deeply imprisoned prisoner. Satan is the guy in solitary at the bottom. Satan's not the king of hell. He's its lowest inmate. God is the king of hell. He rules hell. The prisoners don't rule the prison. The warden does. God has made hell out of his wisdom, out of his love, out of his power, and God rules hell just as he rules every other place. God does not give over and abandon hell to the rulership of Satan. That's absurd and thoroughly unbiblical and unchristian. So God is the king of hell. God rules in hell. Hell is a good place. It's a good thing that hell is there. Well, this is pretty sound theology, and it follows from what Thomas Aquinas has said about there being a necessity of reward and punishment to choices made in this life. If we are genuinely morally responsible agents making our free choices, and we're not determined by the stars, or determined by the strings of the puppet master, or determined by mechanistic fate, and we actually are responsible for the choices, then there must be a destination for the wicked and for the righteous. And when God creates that destination, he's doing it out of love, power, wisdom, and justice. Dante, in the 4th stanza, sees these words and says, "Sir, this sentence is right hard for me." And of course, it's hard for all of us. Hell is a very difficult place to contemplate. But if God is in fact the king of the universe, if he's omnisapient, that is all wise, omnipotent, that is all powerful, then hell is a good place. And so what Dante will see as he travels down through hell is that the justice that prevails on the sinners there and the punishments that they suffer are appropriate to the choices they made in this life. And in the allegory, we're supposed to see a warning. If this is an accurate picture, although it's poetic and not meant to be literal, Dante didn't really think that hell is an inverted cone down in the earth. So far as I know, it wouldn't matter. But in the allegory, it's a warning. We're supposed to see in this an admonition that the little choices I make in my life, how I speak to my wife, how I treat my friends, the little decisions that seem so inconsequential, all build up, and they wear a groove that I tend to follow more and more. And if I make the wrong choices in the small things day after day, eventually I'll make the wrong choice in the big things. There's a cumulative effect, and I wear a pattern for myself that I tend to follow. But if I make the right choices, the same thing will happen. Even the small, seemingly inconsequential choices lead to hell or heaven. One of my favorite modern authors, C.S. Lewis's friend Charles Williams, wrote a series of 7 supernatural novels, you might say, that are brilliant descriptions of this. In all of these novels, he shows how common people caught up in commonplace events, living their commonplace lives, make those tiny choices, little movements of the will for good or evil that all add up to an eternal destination. And that's exactly what Dante is talking about. Well, they proceed down, and they of course come to the they come to the river of hell that we know from mythology, that they have to cross over. And Charon the boatman, they cross over and they come to the first region of hell. It's the region he calls Limbo, and this is in Canto 4. Here in Limbo, he sees an interesting crowd. They have grief not for torment, but for loss undying. By women, men, and children, sighed for sorrowers thick thronged. And his guide says, "These people sinned not, yet their merit lacked its chiefest fulfillment, lacking baptism, which is the gateway to the faith which thou believest, or living before Christendom, their knees paid not aright those tributes that belong to God, and I myself am one of these," said Virgil. Virgil, in fact, has been brought by God's temporary grace out of limbo to guide Dante, but Virgil will have to go back here. This is now his eternal destination. He says, "I'm one of these people." These are people who lived before Christianity and didn't bow their knee to the God that the heavens and their conscience testify to, or were not brought into the Christian church by baptism and so forth. So these people aren't suffering torment, just the eternal loss of never having the vision of God. But then we have a most interesting conversation. In line 46 in this translation, and you'll be close in most translations, about a third of the way through this canto, Virgil asks, "Tell me, sir, tell me, master," I began, in hope some fresh assurance to be gleaning of our sin-conquering faith. "Did any man by his self-merit or on another leaning ever fare forth from hence and come to be among the blessed? Has anybody ever got out of here?" He took my hidden meaning. "When I was newly in this state," said he, "I saw one come in majesty and awe, and on his head were crowns of victory. Our great first father's spirit he did withdraw, and righteous Abel, Noah who built the ark, Moses who gave and who obeyed the law, King David, Abraham the patriarch, Israel with his father in generation, Rachel for whom he did such deeds of mark, with many another of his chosen nation. These did he bless, and know that ere that day no human soul had ever seen salvation." What is that about? Virgil, who we know died about 20 years before Christ, says, when I hadn't been here long, and Virgil hadn't been in hell long when Christ died, and as the Apostles' Creed says, descended into hell while his body was dead in the grave. Christ in spirit descended into hell. Virgil says, when I hadn't been here long, one came, a capital O on the one came crowned in majesty, and he took with him all these people from the Old Testament out of here. Before that time, none had ever escaped. This is what the historic church in the ancient world and medieval world, and to this day many Christians in various branches of Christianity call the harrowing of hell. The idea here is that before Christ came, everyone, the righteous and the unrighteous, went to the land of the dead, to Hades, Sheol in Hebrew. Everyone. Now, not everybody had the same experience there. You might say there's a good side and a bad side. We saw this in Virgil's Aeneid in Book 6, when Aeneas goes into the underworld and he sees great sinners in torment in Tartarus, but the righteous, the patriots, the great heroes in Elysium or paradise. But they're all in the underworld in the land of the dead. We see a similar thing in the New Testament when Jesus talks about the rich man and Lazarus who both die, and the rich man goes to torment and flames, but Lazarus, the poor man, goes to the bosom of Abraham. They're in the same place, in the same region, because they can see and talk to each other, but they're in different parts of the underworld, because between them, Jesus says, as he tells the story, is a fixed chasm across which no man can pass. Even in the New Testament, there's a suggestion that this view of the underworld has some merit. Ancient and medieval Christian doctrine taught that when Christ died, before he was raised bodily on the third day, in spirit he went down to the underworld, and he took with him the souls of the righteous from the Old Testament, Abraham and David and Solomon and Isaiah and so on. And he takes them out of the underworld, out of paradise or Elysium, and he takes them. He brings them with him to the Father. Takes them out. As Ephesians 4 says, he who descended into the lower parts of the earth ascended on high, leading captive a host of captives. Jesus goes to the underworld and takes as his own captives those who had been held captive by death. And so 1 Corinthians 15 has Paul saying, "Where, O death, is your sting? King Hades, the king of death, the king of hell, has been conquered, and Christ has trampled down death by his own death." In this view, which has been held by many Christians throughout history, not all, but very many, in this view of the harrowing of hell, since Christ's time, when the righteous die, they no longer go to the underworld, to the land of death. They go straight to the presence of the Father. For 2 Corinthians 5 and a host of other places in the New Testament suggest this. But before Christ, everyone was kept in the bondage of death, and that's why Christ came, to destroy the power of death over his people. So the harrowing of hell is Christ breaking the bars, taking out his own, and emptying the good side, emptying paradise or Elysium. So now all that's left in the underworld is the bad side. And that's why when we think of hell or Hades or the underworld, we think of only the place of torment, because since the time of Christ, that's its true condition. So Canto 4 is Dante talking about the harrowing of hell. Virgil says, "When I hadn't been here long, one came in majesty and awe," that's Jesus, and he takes out the Old Testament saints. In a number of places in poetry, and of course this is a view held by many Roman Catholics, many Eastern Orthodox, some Anglicans, some Protestants. Most Protestants don't hold to this view. Some of the Reformers held to it, others rejected it. But you'll see this showing up in poetry. Lewis held to something like this. John Milton seems to suggest this. In various works of poetry and literature, you'll see this doctrine referred to, and that's what they're talking about. So they proceed on, and now an interesting thing happens in Canto 6. Let's jump there, and also in Canto 13. Something is mentioned that we can talk about that's connected to Aquinas and all of the Christian history and the doctrine of the resurrection. We're told that when the resurrection comes someday, things will change down here in hell. What will be the final condition of the damned? Because right now, when the resurrection has not come, these are souls in hell. Aquinas, you recall, had said that even the soul in hell, apart from its body, can still suffer torments in the material fire of hell, because the soul has a mystical connection to the body it had and that will be given back to it at the resurrection. So there's a sense in which it can experience torment. But in the resurrection, when the bodies of the unrighteous as well as the righteous are raised, as the Scripture and all of Christian thought teaches, then the souls in hell will be given their bodies back, and now they'll be in hell, soul and body. And so Dante puts it this way in the poem. He says, "They will be perfected in hell." This doesn't mean morally, but it means in their created order. Their body and their soul will be restored to their union together, which is what they need. Remember, Aquinas said, we are made so that the soul is made to be joined to the body. That will happen at the resurrection, but for the damned in hell, this will be more a torment than ever, because now they can experience the torments of hell in body and soul, and not just soul alone. So the sinners in hell will be perfected, that is, they'll be put back together, body and soul, as man is meant to be, but this will be all the worse for them. So this doctrine of perfection doesn't have to do with moral perfection, but the restoration of humanity the way it's supposed to be. But for unrepentant, unregenerate humanity, this will be a terrible thing. We also see, by the way, along with this, in Dante's journey through the underworld, he encounters the souls of suicides. When their bodies are restored to them, their body and soul will not be joined properly, but will be terribly kept apart, though they long to be rejoined, because a suicide, someone who commits suicide, destroys his own self by separating soul from body in killing the body, is deliberately rejecting that union of soul and body that God has made us for, And so their punishment in eternity will be to never quite have the proper restoration and union of soul and body together. A terrible concept when we stop and think about it. Finally, when we get up to cantos 14 through 16, jumping ahead there, and you should have read to somewhere in this vicinity. I think I told you to read through 17. In 14 through 16, we see another interesting set of circumstances. Here we can talk a little bit more about the appropriateness of the punishment to the sins committed. We see, for example, in the thieves, in the circle that they encounter down here, that the thieves are punished by being bitten by vipers, by serpents, and then they burn down to ash, and then they're renewed again, and bitten by vipers and burned down to ash. Their identity is constantly being destroyed by the viper because they tried to destroy, in their attack on other people, by stealing the identities of those other people. And we also see some thieves being, as I mentioned a little bit ago, some thieves who are walking together, who are blending together, and they fight and struggle to stay apart and retain their separate identity, but they can't. They blur, and they find themselves melting into each other, and they can't tell who's who. And this also is a punishment on theft. Behind all of this is a medieval concept of property ownership that consists in a view of my property as an extension of myself. And so, if someone steals my property, and it's an attack on me personally, because my property is an extension, a widening of the boundaries of my self-identity. So, if someone takes my car, if they steal my books, if they take something of some material possession of mine, they're attacking me, myself. And so the thieves in hell, by having refused in life to recognize the boundaries between mine and yours, between meum and tuum, as Dante says, by refusing to respect the boundaries between you and me, by attacking my stuff, are punished in the afterlife by their boundaries not being respected, and they find themselves against their will melting into their neighbor and fighting and struggling and feeling the pain of the loss of their identity. Their attack on others, other identities in life results in an attack on their identity in the afterlife. And we'll see this in many other ways. Those who sinned against heaven, those who sinned against art, those who sinned against nature are punished in various ways. Those who sinned against nature by homosexuality, for example, sodomy, have their heads twisted around to face backwards because they're thinking in a twisted and backward way about human nature, about sexual nature in particular. And there are many other examples of this. Back in in Canto 5, we saw in the circle of the incontinent, those who could not contain their passions and impulses, people, in particular a couple named Paolo and Francesca, being blown about, sailing through the air against their will, never being able to grab the ground, being blown about by winds, because in life they refused to restrain their passions, and so they let themselves be blown about by their lusts and their passions. This couple had happened to commit adultery. So because they're being blown about by their passions in life and never struggled to restrain their passions and work against it, their punishment for eternity is to be blown about by great winds and never to be able to come down to earth and so forth. So we see this as a common pattern over and over in the Inferno. The punishments in hell are allegorical representations of the nature of the sins committed in life. Now, again, did Dante actually think that people suffer these kinds of sins when they, or these kind of torments when they committed those sins in life? I don't know, but it works great in the story. Dante's main point is to say there's consequences for sins, and sins have particular natures, and the particular nature of the sin results in a particular doing of damage to the human person, to human nature, to other people, or to myself, or to my relationship with God. And so in the story, he creates a punishment that illustrates what the nature of sin is, and it helps us to understand that sin. For example, when I read the passage about Paolo and Francesca, I learn that if I don't restrain my passions, if I allow myself to be blown about by these winds, then the punishment that they suffer illustrates what I become. I become rootless, groundless, at the mercy of things that should be my slave, not my master. To prepare for the next lecture, read the second half of the Inferno. You've read up through about Canto 17, so read on to the end, Canto 34. As you're reading, notice the change as Dante and Virgil go down deeper through hell, and notice what hell is described as. Notice what kind of people are there, and think about why Dante would do this, and especially think in terms of the allegory. What is Dante trying to say by the conditions in hell as they go deeper and the kind of sins that are punished there?
In-person conventions are canceled this year, so we are bringing the convention to your home. April 20th through 27th, enjoy all the deepest discounts we normally reserve for conferences and conventions, including free shipping. During the sale, we will also feature full lectures from Old Western culture, as well as a virtual booth time, live videos where we will discuss our products and answer questions in real time. Get all the details at romanroadsmedia.com.